السيدات الفضليات والسادة الأفاضل.
May the blessings of God be upon you all. Welcome to the sixth session of the conference organized by the Doha Institute, the School of Social and Sciences and Humanities. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the school, Dr. Amal, Dr. Noor, and the Center for Conflict Studies and the Museums Commission, and for inviting me to moderate this session, which will be on post-conflict heritage reconstruction in Iraq. We have 4 experts with us. 2 will be here present with us, and 2 will be joining us over the Zoom application. I'll start with the first paper by Dr. Omar Jassam from Mosul University in Iraq, and it will be on cultural heritage management in conflict areas, Mosul as a case study. Dr. Jassam is a professor at Mosul University, and he is an expert in the ECAM, and also he is an expert with the Ministry of Culture in Iraq and for the Darb Zubaydah project, and he is an assistant researcher with the American University in Sulaimania, and is a member of the Lamaso team and a visiting researcher at BSI and Durham University. Dr. Omar has 3 books and a number of articles, and he speaks Arabic, English, and Turkish, and of course, he is with the University of Mosul. You have 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly? مرحبا بكم جميعا وطاب صباحكم.
You in this event, I would like to thank Doha Institute for this value conference. I will talk about cultural heritage management, especially in Mosul city, what happened or what happening there. So before that, please let me speak, presented my presentation in Arabic, and we have some friends makes translation. We need to give them some works there. So صباح الخير مرة ثانية.
Good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen, and from Sumer, Acadia, Babylon, Ashur, Nineveh, Mosul, may the blessings of God be upon you all. It's our pleasure to meet here in Doha, and we hope to meet in other Arab countries. Today I'll be tackling an important subject. I think more or less all the other presentations touched upon this, and that is how to manage the cultural heritage in view of conflict and some negative aspects, interventions, some natural, some man-made, and how can we safeguard and make sure that this heritage will be sustained for future generations. As you may all know, the discipline itself is fairly new, and it has been developing year after year, And because of archaeology and its contribution, is no longer only focusing on what is discovered of sites and artifacts belonging to previous generations and previous civilizations, but now it involves the management of this heritage before it's discovered and after it's discovered, how to safeguard it for future generations who we can say they have the right, of course, to see the heritage that we see today and deal with. You may all be aware of the formidable challenges and dangers and threats, direct or indirect, deliberate or accidental, and most papers talked about these aspects. And maybe we refer more to the human intervention, the negative human intervention, which threatens the cultural heritage of all countries. In view of these dangers, the most important danger or threat is the armed conflicts, whether internally or externally. And although, in my view, these are just the most prominent in causing the destruction, but they are one of human interventions. Maybe looting is even more horrible as a crime, or sometimes deliberate destruction at the time of peace also is more dangerous sometimes on the threatening the cultural heritage. So far as the Iraqi experience is concerned in managing the cultural heritage, the archaeological authorities are made of the Ministry of Information and Culture, and it has the General Department of Heritage, which follows the ministry, and the General Commission, which has subdivisions of inspectorates. We use the term in Iraq, inspectorates, which are located in each of Iraq's governorates, including the one in Nineveh, which Mosul is the capital of. So these inspectorates and inspection departments are in charge of managing the heritage of the country at the national level, and the ones located in each governorate are responsible for their locality, and that includes museums. So, therefore, in the Nineveh governorate, Mosul being the center of this governorate, is as an authority in charge of managing the cultural heritage of the city of Mosul. The city of Mosul, as was mentioned, and I thank all non Iraqis who researched, dealt with, and contributed to the question of the cultural heritage of Mosul. We, as Iraqis, are grateful to them all, and we think this heritage belongs to humanity and not just one single city that we belong to. So you have a share in this as much as we have, and you have a stake in this as much as we have, and you are all aware of Mosul's cultural heritage. There is also there is an intangible heritage which is very important. Even the dialect and the accent of the city of Mosul is something which distinguishes the city, our traditions, our natural habitat. We have the river Tigris, upon the banks of which many settlements, maybe they were the origins of the city itself. We have some also mineral water springs, and we have natural forests and things. And despite the small geographical size, the city went through a very violent struggle and conflict which destroyed people, destroyed the heritage, destroyed, and unfortunately left deep scars and marks which will be difficult to cure for a long time to come. So, therefore, we are struggling to remedy the situation as much as we can, whether materially and physically or at the psychological levels. The authorities in charge of the cultural heritage of the city faced formidable challenges post conflict Mosul because more than 95% of the cultural sites were located in a small part of the city known as the Old City of Mosul on the banks of the river Tigris, and most of the buildings date back to Abbasid and Umayyad and Ottoman eras, were damaged by no less than 95% as a result of the shells and bombings, and this area had mostly the heritage of Mosul. And despite the huge size of the destruction, we were faced with another problem, and that is the lack of resources. And whether we're talking about human resources or financial resources, I think most Arab countries face problems in that, in providing the financial resources to protect the cultural heritage, and also the government's vision so far as providing the basic needs for people like hospitals, schools, and road systems had precedence over the cultural heritage, which unfortunately uh, took secondary importance. The post-conflict, the management of the cultural heritage was exacerbated by the migration of people in view of 3 years of the absence of law and order, and many people left their homes and went to these sites, and this is this is as an image of the map of the Assyrian capital, which is surrounded by this fence, and a lot of building took place, which took more than 2 million square meters out of the um, million, 7 million square meters. After the terrorist militias controlled the city, there were other also uh, issues, and the authorities could not really deal with that and could not remove this illegal building, and many sites during the period of the conflict remained without any renovation or protection. People who visit Mosul know the climatic changes and the changes in seasons, and for years these sites remained totally neglected and faced destruction as a result of the shelling and all the shaking of the ground, and as a result of these shells exploding nearby. This was a formidable challenge we faced and we still are facing today to revive these areas, and that is the amount of unexploded ordnance which is still, and also there was a lot of unexploded bombs, mines, and booby traps, and which needed the intervention of bomb disposal squads before we can move in as archaeologists to deal with the situation. This has been and still is a major obstacle to our work, and a lot of people, the people of the city, had negative feelings about the delay in dealing with the problem, not realizing, of course, the obstacles we had faced. We, in the cultural heritage authorities, had problems, as we said. The city of Mosul is very diverse, and each religious group, each ethnic group has its own symbols. Fortunately, we have some joint symbols inside the city, and part of the challenges or the issues we faced was to revive these joint symbols, to revive or to as way of reconciliation between the people, especially those who left the city, to encourage them to come back to. Some of the important field work that we can go through here, and what the authorities have done in managing the cultural heritage, that is to make an inventory and documentation. This is still a big problem, frankly speaking, in Iraq and maybe in other countries. If we had better documenting of these sites, maybe we wouldn't have lost as many as we have. Unfortunately, in in Mosul, we discovered something after the problem has occurred, and of course, we having better documentation would have helped us prevent some and foresee some of the dangers and not deal with them as they happen. Of course, this old city has narrow alleyways from Al Nuri Mosque to Al Hadba Minaret. In a small, this small passageway, we removed more than 6,000 tons of rubble, concrete. We, most of it was used in the 50s to renovate the mosque in the 50s. Some of it were belonged to the original building materials, which were kept in storage to be used later on. And also some foreign entities took part in rehabilitating some sites, like surveying. Al Nimrud city was totally blown up by the and Hatra also. Okay, we also have the Heidelberg University in the Tel Nabi Yunus area, and Bologna University from Italy, who work in conjunction, and the Museum of Mosul also is uh, renovated now with the help of, and some sites were done through purely Iraqi efforts, like the Tutunchi House, Kharasarai, Barut Khana, all these buildings which belong to Ottoman periods, and also reconstruction efforts led by UNESCO for the Hosh al Bay'a and Al Nuri Mosque. The work of these organizations are very important, whether from abroad or from Iraq, civil society organizations, and I think most of the people present know or participated in this. The University of Mosul also played a role in managing the cultural heritage through providing the academic advice and also through international cooperation. The, there is also a lot of efforts exerted by the local communities. The youth of Mosul have given us some wonderful examples in how to manage the culture and the heritage. They come up with some brilliant ideas to rehabilitate some buildings. They are trying to remarket the city of Sudan for tourists to attract tourists, and thankfully, no less than 50 visitors come to Mosul every day. This is a big figure for us because not long ago the city was under the grips of violent conflict. We can conclude by summarizing the experience of Mosul, which can be generalized, and other cities which went through the same phases of armed conflicts, to understand what happened in Mosul and what are the defects or gaps now in managing the cultural heritage, to learn from them and also to learn from the positive aspects in post conflict reconstruction, so that everybody will get a better idea in managing the threat faced by the cities. Thank you very much. I apologize, but I have a video of two minutes which will give you an idea of the city of Mosul today, which I invite you all to visit. For those who don't know Mosul, of course. This video was produced by a team from Mosul, which is trying to represent the culture of the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Omar, for your intervention. I would like to thank you for your efforts, especially following the setback that Mosul has witnessed, where some part of the city has been destroyed, and we have indeed made donations to the Bureau of the Mosul University following its liberation from ISIS, and we hope that we shall cooperate with you and with the University of Mosul and the academia by and large. Definitely, you will be receiving some questions at a later stage. I'll move to Dr. Andrew Petersen, who is joining us via Zoom. Dr. Andrew is an archaeologist, and Dr. Khan also will be joining us from Tehran. Dr. Andrew Petersen is the head of the Islamic architecture archaeology, and he studied in St. Andrew, and he studied architecture in Oxford, and he also had a thesis on Palestine during the Ottoman Empire at the Wales University. He is a fellow at the Royal Academy, and he has published extensively on these subjects, especially the heritage in the Middle East, the latest of which in 2021 are Ramla, the Islamic Palestinian city. Dr. Andrew will be talking about the Heat castle in the western part of Iraq and its rehabilitation. Welcome, Mr. Andrew. Welcome to the Doha Institute. Please, the floor is yours. شكرا. بدء شكرا جزيلا لك. شكرا لنور ولموظفي معهد الدوحة لدعوتي إلى هذا المؤتمر. ولأسباب تقنية لم أستطع أن أكون معكم حضوريا، ولكن سوف أوفر لكم بعض
project that we're working on at the city of Heat in Anbar province in Iraq. Yeah. So what I will do is I will show you a PowerPoint and I will talk a little bit about the project and some of the problems and some of the potential for success of this project. Right. Okay.
I don't know if our colleague can help you about this technical issue.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, Heat Citadel, and I'll be talking about the role of cultural heritage in post-conflict urban regeneration. The city of Heat is located on the Euphrates in Anbar province between Ramadi and Haditha. This was a very important city, and the first time it is mentioned by name in documents is from the 9th century BC in an Akkadian inscription. The city of Heat has been known by various names, Idu, Itu, Is, and Dakhira. We know that the city was important for the bitumen, Gheer, which was produced on the Euphrates in this area and was used very widely. We have the first record of its use from 3500 BC in southern Iraq. And so that's over 5,000 years ago. It was already exporting bitumen. Heat was a very pleasant city, surrounded by palm gardens, and it is geographically, it is important as the location where the irrigation first becomes possible, because the level of the water starts to rise above the level of the surrounding plain. So it's an area which can be irrigated.
Sorry, Dr.
This
Andrew.
is a few.
Sorry, we can't
Yes.
see your presentation.
Oh, you can't
I
see
think-
it. Okay, hang on. Escape. All right.
Yes, okay now.
Okay, good. And I'll switch it on to full. Apologies for that. Okay. So this is a view of this, a postcard of the city of Heat from, I think, the 1980s, showing the pleasant location of the city, and also this postcard shows part of the Citadel area, which is going to be the focus of this presentation. Before, although Heat has a number of different heritage assets, or it certainly did before the conflict. So it's, as you can see from this view, it has a very pleasant location on the Euphrates. It's very nice air, and it's the other thing that it's famous for is Nuair, or water wheels, and these are used for lifting. These are powered by the river, and they're used for lifting water up to the level of the surrounding plain for irrigation. These have recently been registered as with UNESCO as part of World Heritage. So the other important heritage area in aspect of Heat is the bitumen wells, or Ayun al Ghair, and as I mentioned earlier, we know that this bitumen was exported from at least the 4th millennium BC to other parts of Iraq. So they're very important. This is just one of the bitumen wells which is in existence. And then one other aspect of the heritage of Heat which is worth mentioning is the use of the bitumen to make boats. On the left-hand side, you can see the Ispia, or Kaya, which is a unique boat made in Heat to transport materials along the Euphrates. And these were coated in bitumen and floated down to Baghdad and other cities. And then they could be dismantled and carried by camel or horse back to Heat. So these were the transport barges for Heat. And on the right is the famous Iraqi gufa, again made using wicker work and lined with bitumen. One last element of Heat, which is the heritage, which is worth mentioning, is the Hamad Afdan Museum, which is a popular museum for crafts and the local heritage of Heat. And this is in the western part of Heat in the new area. So those are some just a quick overview of the heritage of Heat as it existed before the takeover of ISIS. So ISIS captured the city of Heat in on the 2nd of October 2014, and were in control of the city, the citadel, until the 15th of April 2016. So that's yeah, sort of for about a year and a half they were in control control of the city. And during that time, they settled in the area of the old city, or the citadel, rather like in the city of Mosul, which was mentioned earlier. So one thing that's important to say is during the 1920s, after the expulsion of the Ottomans from Mesopotamia, the old city of Hit became people started moving outside the old city and living elsewhere, and only a few families were left living in the old city. So by the 1980s, again, there are only a few people living in the old city, but it had become recognized as a heritage area and also an area of potential archaeological significance. It has never been excavated, but as we know from inscriptions and from historical sources, we know that this was a very, very important city. So, which was beneath the heritage Ottoman city. So when ISIS took over Hit in 2014, they largely based themselves in the area of the old city, partly because they recognized that this was the heart of the city. This had a great cultural significance, and also because this is an area that they could occupy without pushing people out of their homes. So ISIS was eventually retaken in Hit was eventually taken from ISIS in April 2016, and by a coalition of Iraqi forces assisted by Americans, and also significantly Sunni militias. Now, one of the problems of the retaking of the city was the destruction of much of the area, not only the old city, but the immediate environment. So you can see this modern building, which has been badly damaged and is actually leaning as a result of the fierce conflict which took place to recapture the city. Again, this is the status of the citadel today. It's largely in ruins. A very fierce battle which took place in April 2016, series of battles, has really reduced much of the citadel area to ruins. And there is still the problem of exploded, unexploded ordnance, and other potential hazards within the citadel. So the aim of this project, SBAH, the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage in Iraq, identified Hit as one of the priorities for heritage reconstruction, rehabilitation. This is partly because of the extremity of the devastation caused to the city during both its capture and recapture, and the destruction of the heritage asset, and also because, unlike other areas of Iraq, it has not received much international attention. So, and this is something which probably is worth discussing later, is that a lot of international attention has been placed on sites such as Babylon and other Ctesiphon, Al-Madain, and other famous cities within Iraq. And the city of Hit has largely been ignored by international funding organizations and international attention. Yet its heritage importance is significant and not really fully investigated. And also the destruction was on a level with that which was seen in Mosul. So it was certainly in need of urban regeneration. So on this basis, the State Board of Antiquities, SBAH, in collaboration with the University of Wales, formulated a project which would address some of these issues and start to improve conditions within the city. So the main aims of the project are firstly to make the area safe for residents. Unlike places like Erbil Citadel and some other areas in Iraq, the citadel is still inhabited today, despite the fierce battles which took place. It's still inhabited today. The second aim was to rehabilitate heritage buildings using traditional techniques and local people. In other words, using the local people to actually carry out work and to conserve buildings using the traditional techniques which still exist in the area. The third aim was to identify key heritage buildings and areas within the citadel. So the citadel is a very large area, and the idea is to target certain areas to see how they can be developed. The fourth element was archaeological excavations. As I mentioned, there have been no excavations at this site, and we don't even know the depth of archaeological deposits or actually the time range of surviving material within the city. This is just a view of one of the houses which is still inhabited in the old city. You can see it's well looked after. People still live here, yet amongst these very disturbing ruins. Here's another example of one of the traditional houses of Heat, which is still occupied today.
Dr. Andrew, 5 minutes.
Okay, so I'll just show you some views of traditional architecture in the city. One important thing to say is that these, although these look like they're quite old decorations, this form of decoration, plaster stucco decoration, was still being made using molds up to the 1970s. So this is a living heritage which still exists. And here are some other examples of the architecture. And also you can see that many of the materials for the rehabilitation, for the use of remaking traditional buildings using local methods and local materials, that still exists within Heat. So that actually wasn't destroyed by the conflict. So what are the challenges of this work? The first, of course, is the presence of unexploded ordnance, mines, improvised explosive devices. And this is something which has been a considerable problem, both for the local residents and also in terms of implementation of this project. Partly because because of the depth of rubble, it's quite difficult to actually anticipate where any of this material will occur. We've addressed that using a specialist mine clearance organization, Tetra Tech, which works with the Iraqi government. The second challenge is, and this is of course a sensitive issue, again sensitive, is the potential for corruption, and in terms of working with people in an area of very high unemployment, poverty, and where many foreign institutions are reluctant to work in this area. The third problem is the potential for further unrest. So, for example, in December, there was an ISIS attack on some Iraqi soldiers. That's very recent. The way of mitigating this is by having a flexible schedule. And the fourth sort of challenge, which I think is very, very significant in terms of cultural heritage redevelopment, rehabilitation, is getting local communities involved. In other words, not doing something which ignores the local communities, but something which engages them. And that's been embedded in the project as part of consultation, a continuous consultation throughout the whole process. Now, I should say that the project, a little bit about the funding. It has three main funders, which are ALIF, which is the Alliance International Poor Heritage, and these are the main funders of the project. Secondly, the British Council Cultural Protection Fund will be funding excavations. And thirdly, the Nahrain network from UCL will be funding work on community heritage, which is specifically development of the museum and development of heritage trails throughout the city. And all of these activities together are designed to improve the economic prospects of the city, and already we have large numbers of tourists visiting the water wheels, but the idea is to make this much more of a tourist area within Iraq, and to importantly make heat much less isolated, because from its location in Western Iraq, to a certain extent, it is isolated from the rest of the country. Here's some tourism, and again you can see this is another view of the Mohammad Afdan Museum with a view of the a version of the Nouria. Within the museum, you can see some of the collection, which is very interesting and has been collected over a period of 50 or more years, but which, however, is very much in need of development. And lastly, I'll just return again to the bitumen processing and mention a project on boat building in Iraq, where they're actually reviving the fabrication of Ispia, these cargo boats which are used on the Euphrates. And so that's just a quick overview of the project. And I suppose the most important aspect of this project is collaboration and local involvement, so that people can see that their heritage is being developed for them, for their benefit, with their participation. Okay, and just lastly, a view of the cafe, which expresses the some of the values of heat. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Petersen. شكرا جزيلا على هذه الورقة التي أعتقد أنها مهمة وتضيء يعني أولا هي
because it has field work like Dr. Omar, and also highlights an area which we have not seen a lot of interest in, like we've seen with other areas. Now we move to our third paper by Dr. Bijan Rouhani, who will also take us back to a period which was almost forgotten, and that is the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988. He is from the University of Oxford, and his work involves cultural heritage in protracted wars, a case study of the Iran-Iraq war, and also using new techniques in dealing with and mitigating the dangers to cultural heritage, and in post-conflict areas, who is the head of the um, program pertaining to emergency in e-commerce, and he represents the council now for the Blue Shield, and also at King's College, Dr. Rouhani obtained his PhD from Rome University in Italy, and his thesis dealt with protecting the. طاب صباحكم. أود أولا أن أشكر معهد الدوحة
Organizers of the conference and Dr. Noor for their kind invitation to this important conference. My joint paper is with Dr. Bill Finlayson, who is not here today, but I'm delivering our joint paper. And the title has a slightly changed to Cultural Heritage in the Iran-Iraq War, the Forgotten Legacy of a Protracted War. The Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988, was one of the 20th century's longest interstate wars, with hundreds of thousands of casualties and widespread damage to historic city centers, monuments, museums, and intangible heritage of both countries. However, despite the fact that the protection of cultural properties during armed conflict, especially after the Second World War, has become a global concern, as crystallized in the 1954 Hague Convention, cultural heritage destruction received little international attention during the Iran-Iraq War. During the conflicts of the last 2 decades in the Middle East and North Africa region, or MENA, international attention became refocused on the issue of cultural heritage destruction and how to safeguard it during war. In this presentation, in this paper, we question why so little attention was paid to the issue of cultural heritage in the Iran-Iraq War, and what divergences existed between that and more recent conflicts in MENA. In 2001, the Taliban's deliberate destruction of Buddha statues in Afghanistan, amplified and perhaps even encouraged by the power of mainstream media, was one of the landmark moments that redrew worldwide attention to the protection of ancient sites. The widespread destruction and looting that followed the US-led military invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003 prompted strong criticism and condemnation of the US forces' lack of planning and inability to protect Iraq's heritage. With the rise of ISIS or Daesh in 2014, the propaganda destruction of heritage sites in Iraq and Syria made protecting cultural heritage a global concern, at the same that international concern regarding the protection of cultural heritage increased its propaganda value. After the outbreak of the Syrian civil war and the subsequent rise of ISIS or Daesh, many projects were initiated for remote sensing, monitoring, and documentation of at-risk cultural heritage, as well as digital reconstruction of destroyed sites and objects, aimed to preserve the memory of lost or endangered heritage, raise global awareness, and promote reconstruction. These were primarily established by the US, UK, and EU or European Union institutions and universities. In Iraq, Revive the Spirit of Mosul, a reconstruction campaign led by UNESCO, received $105.5 million from 15 partners, including the UAE and the EU. Also, sponsored by the UK government, the British Museum launched a £2.9 million Iraq scheme program in 2015 for the reconstruction of Iraqi heritage. By December 2022, ALIF, or International Alliance for the Protection of Heritage in Conflict Areas, had 25 projects with a total budget of $10.5 million in Iraq. But the situation for cultural heritage during the Iran-Iraq War was completely different. The Iran-Iraq War formally began on September 22, 1980, with air and land invasions by the Iraqi army under Saddam Hussein's leadership, following the rise in tension between the two countries after Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. The invasion took place after the revolution had destabilized Iran. Many archaeologists and cultural heritage professionals, such as Firuz Bagherzadeh, the prominent archaeologist and founder of the Iranian Center for Archaeological Research, or ICAR, were purged because they were considered counter-revolutionary. In revolutionary Iran, archaeology, especially pre-Islamic heritage, was viewed with great suspicion, as it was considered synonymous with the nationalistic approach of the Pahlavi era, I mean the monarchy system before the revolution, which integrated the golden past or the ancient past into its political agenda, much as the Ba'ath Party in Iraq used ancient heritage extensively for government propaganda and the ideology of national unification. The war had different phases in terms of strategies and tactics, as well as international reactions, each of which left different effects on the cultural and natural resources of the two countries. In the early months of the war, the Iraqi army managed to occupy some cities in the south and west of Iran, including Khorramshahr, and a total of about 15,000 square kilometers in the three provinces of Kermanshah, Elam, and Khuzestan. After Iranian forces reclaimed large portions of the occupied regions, both sides, both armies, were trapped in their trenches for a long period. The frontier from north to south encapsulated significant prehistoric sites in the plains of Dehloran and Mehran, large areas of the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, as well as important Seleucid, Parthian, Sasanian, and Islamic sites. To stop the opposing forces, both sides dug huge trenches, ditches, and water canals, one of them running for 30 kilometers. The engineering units of the Iraqi army constructed earthworks, also using the ancient ramparts to create defensive fortifications. A concentration of such defensive fortifications was built to protect the strategic city of Basra against Iranian invasions, which caused irreparable damage to ancient sites such as Kharax, Spasinu, and ancient Parthian city. The Sassanid city of Ayvan Karkhe in Iran was the location of fierce conflict. Iraqi forces had advanced to the western fortifications, while Iranian had taken up position near the eastern wall. The entrance gate and the royal palace were both destroyed as a result of the firefights. Damage was also caused by the Iranian forces digging trenches inside the ancient towers and defenses. The area was heavily mined, which made any archaeological survey or excavation impossible for long after the war. Even decades after the war ended, the extensive usage of landmines remained a major concern in both countries, contaminating large areas, including a 5-kilometer wide minefield in Iraq that ran along the border for about 1,600 kilometers. It was also estimated that millions of landmines were left in Iran, especially in Kurdistan, Kermanshah, Elam, and Khuzestan provinces. Even 2 decades after the war, any archaeological survey or protection in many archaeological sites was impossible due to the explosive remnants. Mine clearance of these vast areas on both sides in 2 countries was done very slowly. In Iraq, these efforts were repeatedly stopped due to subsequent conflicts. Furthermore, archaeologists were concerned about potential damage to historical places contaminated with landmine because of the method employed to clear them. Military use of cultural properties caused damage to them as well. Because of their relative elevation, Iran mounted anti-aircraft weapons on a number of ancient sites, notably the top of the ziggurat of Chagazambil, which was founded around 1250 BCE and included on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1979. Other historic monuments like the Semnan Caravanserai and the Susa Museum were used as either ammunition storage or detention centers for war prisoners. Iranian tactics changed after 1984, and Basra came under artillery and bombardment, causing major portions of the city to be damaged and some neighborhoods to be destroyed, including the historic regions and neighborhoods. Iran captured the Al-Fav Peninsula and its important cities for 2 years in 1986. When the Iraqi army recaptured Al-Fav town, it was destroyed because it had witnessed the most intense fighting between two armies. The War of the Cities was another brutal episode of the conflict, employing air raids, missile assaults, and artillery shelling, which wreaked devastation on cultural heritage in addition to civilian losses. The first stage started in 1984 with the targeting of the historic Iranian city of Desful by Scud B missiles. As a result of several attacks, more than half of the historic center of Desful was destroyed. Other cities, including Tehran, Tabriz, Isfahan, Qom, Abadan, Ahvaz, Susangerd, Ilam, Kermanshah, and Dimeshq, were attacked later. In retaliation, the Iranian army bombarded the cities of Basra, Khanaqain, Al-Fav, Al-Qarna, Baghdad, Mandali, and Soleimaniye in Iran and caused considerable damage. Both Iran and Iraq had signed and ratified the 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural properties during armed conflict at the time of the war. In 1985, both countries warned the UNESCO of each other's attacks on cultural property, particularly the Jame Mosque in Isfahan of Iran and the Imam Ali Mosque in Basra in Iraq. Personal representatives of the UNESCO Director General visited Iran in 1985 and 1987 and visited Iraq in 1986. And this is a photo from their visit to Isfahan. Compared to conflicts before and since, something was different about this war that meant that cultural heritage destruction did not arise as a big issue, neither between the participants, despite their opposing ideological positions, nor with the international community. The conflict was a local war between two regional powers with much shared heritage and history. While the Iran-Iraq war was between two sovereign states, most of the other recent conflicts have been at least portrayed as something else, either uprising, interventions by the US or world community as policemen, or regime change. This may have led to big differences in the type of moral justification felt necessary to allow war. Later conflicts, including the US-led invasions, had to stress their legality, following the law liberating people, so regardless of actual impacts, had to be clear they held the moral high ground by claiming to protect heritage. The situation was different again when the time Daesh emerged. Daesh were specifically fighting a cultural war, and one where the Western, especially UNESCO response, effectively encouraged the targeting of heritage and consequent escalation in the rhetoric of cultural heritage protection. The context of Iran-Iraq war in the closing years of the Cold War was completely different from the subsequent wars in the Middle East and North Africa. Following the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran quickly shifted from a close ally to one of America's main adversaries. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein's rule, never became a trusted friend of the United States, too. It is impossible to say whether the destruction of heritage in two countries not allied with the West went unreported for this reason or not. However, having no direct engagement with either participant may have contributed to this undue disregard. Destruction caused by the military occupation of Iraq in 2003 was explicitly attributed to the invading forces' failure. As a result, it was expected that the Western academic community and cultural heritage professionals would uniformly call for the preservation of Iraq's heritage. During the Syrian conflict, the potential of military intervention through UN blue helmets to protect heritage sites was also widely discussed. The massive propagandist destruction of heritage in recent MENA conflicts, widely covered by the Western mainstream and social media, also helped significantly to elevate the issue on a worldwide scale. Such media attention, prompted by intentional destruction, causes the allocation of resources for their protection and reconstruction. The absence of social media, the internet, and open access satellite imagery for researchers during the Iran-Iraq war, which served an important function in monitoring and information and informing the state of cultural heritage during the recent MENA conflicts, limited coverage of heritage destruction. Most of Iran's cultural ties with the West were lost following the Islamic Revolution, including the majority of joint archaeological activities. In Iraq, the activities of some Western institutions and missions such as the German Archaeological Institute or DAA and the British School of Archaeology in Iraq continued with many restrictions and sometimes with interruptions. 5 minutes? 3 minutes. Although professionals from Iran's Cultural Heritage organization and Iraq's State Board of Antiquities worked hard to safeguard cultural heritage within their means, the conflict seriously harmed both organizations' financial and administrative capacities. The professionals did not receive any, in both countries, did not receive any significant international support for the emergency response to cultural heritage. In addition to external factors, save for the work of government specialist agencies, there was no significant activity by civil society and NGOs in either Iran or Iraq for the protection and promotion of cultural heritage. The severely restricted political environment in both countries rendered any activity outside of official and government boundaries nearly impossible. In conclusion, military occupation by coalition forces or the possibility of direct intervention is one of the factors that distinguishes later MENA or Middle East and North African conflicts from the Iran-Iraq war. The absence of a strategic value in cultural property protection for any superpower due to their lack of direct military involvement was a key contributory factor. There was no targeting of the global mainstream media and their audiences, and so the deliberate propaganda destruction of heritage was not present in this war. The lack of digital communication and monitoring technology was another factor contributing to poor reporting of heritage destruction. The absence of independent and robust civil societies for the protection and monitoring of cultural heritage in either of these two countries left these two to governmental agencies severely constrained by resources and increasingly isolated from the international community. Thank you very much.
شكرا دكتور روحاني على هذه الورقة القيمة.
For this valuable paper, which really adds and sheds light on an area which was rather unknown because of the impact of the or lack of it of the Iran-Iraq war on the international scene. Now we have the last intervention via Zoom, which will be presented by Dr. Mohammad Hassan Khani, and will be entitled Post-War Reconstruction as a Means of Cultural Diplomacy, Iranian Initiatives in the Construction of Holy Shrines in Iraq. He is an associate professor and he heads the Imam Sadiq University's Department of International Relations. He is a visiting lecturer at Tehran University and he holds a PhD in peace studies from Bradford University in the UK. And 2016, he joined the advanced studies in Middle Europe in Budapest Institute and the Berlin Institute. He also contributes to a journal, Eurasia, and also a member of the Iranian International Relations Society. He has many writings in Farsi and English, and also he has an extensive array of interviews with CNN, Reuters, BBC, Al-Ahram, and others. دكتور محمد حسن، شكرا لك ومرحبا بك، ولديك 20 دقيقة. شكرا، هل تسمعونني؟ مرحبا بكم من طهران، ويسعدنا أن نكون معكم اليوم رغم أن
I would like to thank the organizers of this event, Rouhani Institute, and other institutions. Thank you very much for having me. The topic of my presentation is post-war reconstruction as a means of cultural diplomacy. And I take the Iranian initiative in the construction of holy shrines in Iraq as a case study. War and conflicts are always a source of hopelessness, despair, frustration, hatred, and destruction. Living in an environment of conflict, violence, and war, and witnessing a continuous process of destruction brings a sense of collective anguish and desolation to the society as a whole and to every individual as a member of that society. And talking about the reconstruction process brings a light of hope and sympathy in terms of the aid and the assistance that are coming. During the past decade, especially after the defeat of the so-called Islamic State, Daesh, there have been enormous plans for reconstruction of public places and infrastructures, including religious sites and holy shrines in Iraq. Although a big part of this effort is planned domestically by Iraqi government itself, yet very soon a new actor from a neighboring country arrived. Iran, as the most populated Shia majority country, stepped in to speed up the reconstruction of holy shrines. According to the available data and facts on the ground, particularly those related to mega projects in Najaf and Karbala, the Iranian endeavor, which was mostly conducted and implemented by Iranian NGOs and supported by Iranian government, made a huge difference in terms of the size and speed of reconstruction efforts, maybe not comparable to any other similar reconstruction project anywhere in post-war Iraq. This article is an attempt to explore the different aspects and dimensions of the Iranian involvement in the construction of Shia holy sites in Iraq, and also pays attention to its impacts on the Iran-Iraq relations. The paper argues that this initiative, due to the popular support got from religious and social groups, and also from other non-governmental entities in both countries, and also because of its nature and roots in culture and its relations to art and architecture in particular, can be seen as an act of cultural diplomacy. The article further investigates the challenges facing this endeavor among both Iranian and Iraqi communities. As Amal Bohros and her colleagues argue, post-conflict reconstruction does not take place in a vacuum, but rather in a context that has its own political, socio-economic, and cultural structures. Post-conflict reconstruction process often pay only scant attention to culture, heritage, and social relations. Yet, for their outcome to be more sustainable, it is important that recovery plans focus on more than solely rebuilding the physical environment and economic structures. Restoring cultural and religious practices and improving social relations are therefore essential for more sustainable outcome and constitute a key component of a holistic approach to post-war or post-conflict reconstruction, unquote. The Iraqi society, overwhelmed by decades of war and conflict and divided by sectarian animosity, seems to be a good example in this regard. However, the post-war Iraq, for Shia majority at least, was a different story. The post-war period was a new era of religious freedom, bringing them a sense of hope, togetherness, and attachment, energized and motivating them for reconstruction efforts. For the majority of Iraqi Shia population, the neighboring country Iran was a source of hope, inspiration, assistance, and support during three phases of Iraqi contemporary history, namely during Saddam Hussein dictatorship, during American occupation, and then during fighting with Daesh. During Saddam Hussein's run of terror, a huge number of Iraqis took refuge in Iran and even joining Iranian Revolutionary Guard to fight against Saddam. During American occupation, although they pragmatically appreciated the US role to overthrow Saddam Hussein, yet they did not compromise their solidarity with their old ally Iran and aligned with Tehran, displaying their frustration and anger over the consequences of the US occupation. And finally, at the third phase, when the Islamic State peril got imminent by becoming an existential threat to the territorial integrity of Iraq, again, the only helping hand and viable ally was Iran. In the eyes of the huge majority of Iraqis, their victory over Daesh was partly due to the Iranian assistance demonstrated in the General Soleimani's role to unify Iraqi popular mobilized forces backed by overwhelming Iranian logistical support, and partly to the role played by Iraqi religious authority Marja'iyya. Both of them had something to do with the Shia doctrine and Iran. It was in this context that post-war reconstruction in Iraq proceeded, and very soon was shaped by another big event of annual Arba'in March, in which millions of Iranians and other nationalities took part. This whole thing contributed to the Iranian presence in Iraq, not only in political and security issues, but also in social and cultural terms. And that is why Iranians were willing and enthusiastic to participate in the post-conflict reconstruction in Iraq, and why their participation was welcomed by Iraqis. It was apparently a win-win scenario for both sides, continuing their long-term established joint cooperation. From an Iranian point of view, the alliance between Tehran and Baghdad, while under the banner of the solidarity, was basically an ideological and, most importantly, a cultural one in its broad definition. And if the two nations were to continue their cooperation in the long term, the culture and cultural ties should be main focus and the core of their attention. In other words, in their view, the religious culture, or the culture manifested in rituals such as Ashura, Arba'in, martyrdom, ziyarat, and so on and so forth, were the core of their religious culture, something that was demonstrated in the common values such as sacrifice, brotherhood, unity, hospitality, and the concept like this, which came into practice in the coming years. Hence, it constitutes the foundation and the backbone of a special relationship between the two nations, and it must be protected, which must be protected in their view, and strengthened by any means. And the best means, in their view, is the one with a cultural nature and spirit. In this context, involving in the construction of holy shrines has more a cultural mission than its physical and material dimension. The cultural dimension of the construction, therefore, seems to be as important as other dimensions of the construction. In the words of Nicholas Stanley Price, in many post-war situations, there is evidence of a popular concern to restore immediately war-damaged heritage and to revive traditions that before the war had been obsolescent. These concerns seem to answer the strong psychological need to reestablish the familiar and the cherished following of a phase of violence disruption of normal life. In such situation, the crucial role of culture must be recognized to revive and promote an Islamic heritage, something that serves the interests of both Iran and Iraq and also enhances the elements of unity, harmony, and brotherhood between the two nations with an Iranian signature on it. Although Iranian government and its affiliated institutions play an important role in reconstruction projects in Iraq in terms of the bureaucratic coordination with the Iraqi government and logistical support for the projects, yet the overwhelming financial burden those voices, especially among the secular segment of the Iranian society, who criticize harshly expending huge amount of Iranian money outside country while it needed badly inside. According to them, Iran should first take care of its poor and especially its own post-Iran-Iraq war reconstruction projects before going for charity abroad. In their views, it's not acceptable that Iran plays a big role in post-conflict construction in Iraq at the expense of its own people. However, it seems that those who are in favor of Iranian contribution to post-war Iraqi reconstruction of holy shrines still have a louder voice relating the whole thing to a religious duty of the Iranian people. The second challenge comes from those Iraqi groups and political parties who are not proponents of Iran and see this presence as a tool for increasing the Iranian influence in Iraq. These groups include mostly secular political parties, Sunni communities, and even some Shia groups who are not among the Iranian allies. Now, the conclusion. Contributing to the post-conflict reconstruction in Iraq can serve as the causes of cultural diplomacy for many reasons, including the following. Reconstruction, cultural and religious sites leaves enduring cultural messages as long as the sites are standing there. The message carries elements of common values which are at the core of culture, something that we can call it a common cultural heritage between Iran and Iraq. Cultural diplomacy through contribution to reconstructing reflects a humanitarian message, showing a sense of sympathy and compassion between two sides. Reconstruction, cultural and religious sites may be perceived as a material foreign aid with a cultural nature, which does pay more than merely money to the receiver. Reconstruction, cultural and religious sites does not end when the process of reconstruction is over. It continues and extends its effects far into the future, since the projects require constant maintenance and repair. Moreover, this continuity and endurance goes far beyond the material repair and physical maintenance. Its cultural values and non-material influence and effects remains there almost eternally, as long as the sites themselves exist, centuries or even millennia. Reconstruction of cultural and religious sites, especially those with decorative art and fine arts, such as mirror works, gildings with gold and silver, calligraphy, miniature, wood carving, etc., leaves behind a fingerprints of their creators as art masters whose name and nationality and fame will last eternally right beside their works, and this is perhaps one of the best ways to introduce a nation's culture. And finally, it seems that the Iranian contribution to the post-war reconstruction, even though covering a very small segment of it, proved to be a relatively successful one. As discussed by Heidi Mastunga in his report for the World Bank, and I quote, reconstruction efforts require external actors to understand national and local context, to build effective relationships with diverse national and local actors, and to manage these relationships and expectations in the context of extreme danger and volatility. External actors also need to respond and to navigate their own priorities and objectives in accordance with local needs and contexts. Looking at the reconstruction projects done by Iran in Iraq, it seems that the Iranian role has been following the above guidelines mentioned in the World Bank report, and that could be a reason that why, generally speaking, it could be seen as a success, no matter what the challenges remains to be. Thank you very much for your attention, and here there are a few slides I would like to share, if I could. It's just the pictures of the shrines and sites in which the Iranians are involved in. A number of them has pictures from before the reconstruction and after reconstruction. Okay, let me try. Okay, can you see it?
No. Yes, no.
Not yet. Now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. The project are basically concentrated in Karbala, Najaf, Samarra, and Kalbamain, these four cities. And it is interesting for you maybe to know that, you know, the demand for participation in the project is really interesting here in Iran. Although the financial issues and economic situation is not very good, but still there is a very long list of the volunteers who ask to be sent to Iraq to get involved in the reconstruction projects. We're talking about the expertise from the engineers, civil engineers, also electricians, and those who are expert in the handiworks. So there are huge demands to go there and to contribute to the reconstruction projects in those cities. So the feeling is the cultural heritage is revival of the cultural heritage, which I mentioned here is not just only the contributing to Iraqi cultural heritage, but what I call it a common cultural heritage between Iran and Iraq, something very different very difficult to differentiate or separate from each other. And these are just the screenshots I took from some of the sites who are just dedicated to inviting people for participation. These are how the people go online and ask to be included in those one. For example, in this one, a lady has said, I have a small carpet or handmade rug. I want to dedicate it to the reconstruction. How can I do it? The other one is another lady who says, I have a few jewelries. I want to sell them and to contribute to the reconstruction projects, just symbolic items. And these are the posters just distributing in the cities that specifically in this one said, what is my share in this reconstruction? So the whole story is a really interesting cultural story behind the reconstruction project. Thank you very much. I would be glad to comment or to answer any question that the audience may have. Thank you.
شكرا.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammad Hassan Khali. Indeed, the reconstruction efforts as a cultural diplomacy might have earned a special session in Iraq. Indeed, I do know that there are initiatives from Qatar, from the United Arab Emirates, and from different Gulf countries that supersede the sectarian lines. Abu Hanifa's shrine will be indeed reconstructed by Turkey. I live in Najaf, and when Najaf was the capital of culture, we have been supported by Turkey. So sometimes, indeed, some countries do rise above the sectarian lines. But anyway, the time is up practically. But as a moderator, perhaps I'll have the jurisdiction to earmark perhaps 15 minutes to receive your questions.
Do you have a question there?
Right.
Yes, I think my I have a couple of questions, sorry. My first one, which is perhaps slightly philosophical, will be for Omar Hassan. You were talking a lot about the different types of rubble that you can find in the destroyed areas, particularly in Mosul. And when we are spending so much time sifting through the rubble, trying to ascertain where and when it came from, you mentioned there was a partial reconstruction or renovation in the 1950s of a site. When we don't know how many reconstruction, rehabilitations, renovations that a site has been through over the years, over the decades, over the centuries, is there any point in continuing to sift through the rubble, or should we just kind of fast track to a complete rebuild of a site and kind of move these reconstructions forward more quickly for the communities? Secondly, for Andrew Petersen, you were talking, if you're still there, sorry, about disproportionate attention being given to heat, the city you were speaking about. And do you think that donors' wishes to focus on more prestigious sites, perhaps considering Mosul with the amount of money that Mosul has benefited from more recently, that is a major contributing factor? And if so, what can we do to encourage donors to perhaps focus more on either preventative safeguarding, less glamorous, less prestigious sites that are perhaps not going to get a lot of international attention, but which still deserve it and still need that attention? And lastly, I think I may have a final question. Yes, for Bijan, you were talking about the 1954 Hague Convention and the fact that each country reported to UNESCO that there had been crimes committed against the perhaps intentional destruction of cultural heritage sites. Are you aware if any of these, either Iran or Iraq, had enacted any preventative safeguarding measures during peacetime prior to the commencement of the conflict themselves, or is there any complicity there? Thank you.
شكرا كتير للمقالات كتير عظيمة.
My question is to Dr. Bijan. I would like to ask about the media coverage. Usually, the media coverage obscures part of the truth, especially when you've talked about the US invasion in Iraq. But at the same time, I think that the academia ought to play a part, ought to play a role as well. Usually, the NGOs are to be blamed, or different groups like ISIS. However, what about the governments? Tell us about Russia, the USA, Britain, and the Raqqa that has been destroyed. So perhaps the media has been kind of biased. Tell us about the academia as well and its role. Thank you.
Saeed Omar.
Thank you, Mr. Omar, for your intervention. I would like just to say that what has transpired, that the site has been destroyed. Perhaps only 5% is there. Do you think that reconstructing the site is feasible, or will it be possible perhaps to leave the site as it is, as a testimony, a historical kind of testimony, because sometimes reconstruction is difficult. Do you think that we need to perhaps apply the new technologies in different kind of sites that still have certain historical elements that are not kind of completely being destroyed, rather than having just rubbles and so on and so forth? So, thank you.
Thank you. My question is for Mohammad Hassan Khani, and also perhaps partially for Bijan. I thought both were incredibly fascinating presentations, and so interesting to sort of hear about the Iran-Iraq war. But I was very interested in the reconstructions of Karbala and Najaf, Imam Ali's tomb, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on how this might lead to future potentials for shared reconstructions or shared interest in reconstructing earlier sites, because the religious sites are obviously motivated by shared religion and shared interest in and shared common living religion. But what is there potential there for earlier sites where there isn't the same shared living activity? You know, the two countries are separated by this recent boundary, but they're obviously the older sites from many, many different periods in earlier history and prehistory. Is there potential there for any kind of shared reconstruction? Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. Also, fascinating panel. And actually, I wanted to connect the last two presentations, because in the last presentation, was a lot of emphasis how important was the Shia heritage for Iran in the last period. But if we do a periodization, how important was that actually in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War? How important were the considerations of destructions and collateral damage in this case when it impacted Shia heritage? And then connected to that, what was the considering the way that the Shia were looking towards Iran, how were they treated during the Iraq war within Iraq as possible, let's say, possible betrayal factors, and how did that impact also their heritage in the country? So it's a more historical question.
Thank you. تفضل.
سؤالي للأخ عمر و to Andres as well بتعلق في الفريق المرمم للمواقع الأثرية.
Carries out the rehabilitation processes. In Palestine, we have the Rouhani organization, and this organization includes volunteers, and they have worked for the last few years. There's also in Jericho another institution that is an NGO. They have nothing to do with the government or the PA. What about Iraq? Do you have NGOs or private kind of teams that play a role in the reconstruction efforts? Thank you. Sinam Naimi from Qatar Museums. I would like to thank you all. My question is addressed to Mr. Omar. Mosul is my city, your city, and indeed thank you for the emphasis on the nostalgia kind of element in this regard. You have talked about the reconstruction efforts, but we feel that it is very slow. Following the 2003, we have worked on certain projects. Yes, indeed, ISIS has destroyed everything in the city, and I agree with you, and you need further support. However, I notice that the work is kind of slow. I touch my hat for those who work on the ground, but still, it is slow. Mr. Andrew, I have a question. You have talked about the city heat, and heat is very famous with its, as a matter of fact, heritage, and it is the first city that has been built by the butcher, the Saffah, the first caliph in Islam. The western area in Iraq is brimful of architectural and heritage sites. So I would like perhaps to ask you to have a survey in place in order to understand the number of sites. There is As-Safah city, there is also Al-Fallujah, there is also Heat, and there are also different cities that do include indeed more kind of architectural and heritage sites. Thank you very much. Mr. Al-Musallam from the Tokyo University. My question is addressed to Mr. Omar. Tell us about the building that you are reconstructing or maintaining. do you have kind of historical documents? In Syria, we are rebuilding parts of Aleppo, and we have historical plans that we can depend on, or maps rather. And as you know, following the Second World War in Europe, cities were rebuilt because they had an archive, they had maps in place. The gentleman from Iran, I have the following question. As I have witnessed some of the works on the historical sites, here we're not talking about maintaining the sites. Here we're talking about rebuilding, reconstructing the religious sites in accordance with the Safavid kind of architecture. The site might have lost its character because of the new reconstruction efforts in the religious sites. What Iran is doing is to serve its own kind of objectives in Iraq. And it has nothing to do with maintaining the sites, but it is to do with radical reconstruction to the Shiite shrines to be used in the contemporary world. This is what I have witnessed personally in 6 or 7 sites in Syria. I haven't visited Iraq. I'm Syrian, and I've seen this in Syria, and I emphasize it is a radical rebuilding of the sites. Yes, if there are no further questions, I'll come. Yes, there is another question. شكرا جزيلا.
What are the most successful mechanisms so far to ensure that the preferences of Mosul's residents for the reconstruction of their cultural landmarks are being taken into consideration by both the Iraqi authorities but also by representatives of UNESCO? Because we remember that during the initial presentation of the designs of Nuri Mosque, like there was a controversial reaction. So how has this improved? Like, was it people's consultation, or like how was it done? And according to for the last presentation again, you addressed the World Bank report and also like the importance of considering the local context. How has Iran dealt with this skepticism of cultural heritage and its role in the reconstruction of cultural heritage being used as a leverage and to expand Iranian influence in the country? How have the Iranian authorities addressed this criticism and also like package their interventions? Thank you.
Thank you. طيب نعود إلى المتحدثين الرئيسيين بنفس الترتيب.
We'll come back to the panelists. Please, 2 minutes each. 2 minutes each. Yes, please. Dr. Omar, thank you very much for posing these questions. I would like to answer succinctly and briefly. We can further talk outside this hall during the break. But this, the mosque that has been bombed, part of it has been pertinent to heritage, and the other part has been maintained in a contemporary kind of fashion. And we have discovered the main musalla, the main prayer room beneath the mosque itself that has been bombed. So the rubble and the size of the rubble is pertinent to the alleys that are close to the mosque and the mosque itself, rather than the prayer room. In answering the gentleman from Libya, indeed, within a brief period of time, the UNESCO has rehabilitated most of the sites. If you visit Mosul, the UNESCO has played a part in addition to the inhabitants of Mosul. There are also people who come to Al-Mosul to see the destruction, and this has been also invested in. As far as the capacity building, the ICROM is supporting the building capacity the capacity building efforts through certain workshops, and the University of Mosul as well provides academic related consultations, and we are diligent on the ground as well, but still I would like to thank those who worked with us, and I would like to say that we are experienced now because of what we have done, and indeed this has been splendid. As far as the modus operandi and the slowness of the work, as you know, there are certain new elements that have surfaced and new discoveries, but still this is kind of controlled by the funder, and sometimes the funding has been obstructed in some of the projects, and this has affected our work, and that's why it has been a bit slow because of the lack of funds. And yes, certain projects are slow, and certain issues are pertinent to the support, and but at the end of the day, things are getting better. As far as the historic maps of the city, yes, I think France in the 70th and the 80s had some maps, and also the University of Mosul had certain archive, in addition to the archive that Italy has played the part in. Yes, there is an archive, but it is not up to the standards. As far as the community input, I think there are consultations that are going on. The Egyptian team, for example, had played a role in this. The UNESCO is very important, is very keen on liaising with the community, because the community has its own tradition that ought to be preserved. Thank you. Dr. Andrew, please. Are you with us, Dr. Andrew? Yes. نعم، شكرا لطرح السؤال.
Yeah, so in answer to the first question, how it is possible to make sure that the heritage intervention relates to sites that matter to the local Iraqi community. I can say in the case of heat, for example, we listened to the recommendations of SBAH. And also, I should say, there's another factor here, which is many international institutions are their focus, I suppose, is on the sites for which they have their expertise, and that expertise is predominantly in the pre-Islamic era. So I'd say, in answer to that, the two things are to find out, to ask SBAH as the government organization what they're interested in, and what they prioritize, and secondly is to I suppose carefully match the foreign institutions, which are sometimes necessary, with the needs of the projects. In answer to the just a small question in relation to somebody from Palestine was asking if there's any local Iraqi initiatives. I think there are a few. One I'd mention is the Liwan Institute, which is a new NGO which has been set up within in Baghdad specifically to deal with these heritage issues, and I think that there may be some more, but they're in an early stage of development. That's what I'd say. And finally, in answer to Sinan Naimi's question about heat, yes. it would be very good to do a survey in the area around heat, and the whole area requires further work. And surprisingly, even before the 2023 invasion, the amount of research in this area is limited, and yet it would repay further work. I should mention the city of Anna, or the island of Anna, which was excavated during the 1980s as part of the a dam project, the Haditha dam. The site is now submerged, but that was subject to an extensive campaign of archaeological excavations and heritage documentation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Andrew. Thank you for participation. Now, Dr. Rouhani, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for questions. The first question on the Hague Convention and how the convention was implemented by both countries. Yeah, both countries periodically submitted reports to UNESCO and the convention committee. I could say during the conflict, 2-3 reports from both sides were submitted, listing the number of sites that were damaged or were at risk. They also, for example, Iran established, because the convention asks you to establish a unit within your military forces for the protection of cultural heritage. Iran established a unit for heritage protection. Both countries also translated the convention, and Iraq reported that they established training on the convention and heritage protection. Both countries, according to the convention, they tried to evacuate museums where that was possible. For example, Baghdad Museum, it was evacuated, and some of site museums, they were evacuated. Iran, I mean, few museums in Iran, they were targeted, like Susa or Shush Museum or Abadan Museum, and Falak al-Aflaq Museum in Khorramabad. Evacuation happened, but during bombardment from Susa Museum, and also the National Museum in Tehran, that was evacuated, and some artifacts were hidden in safe places. So that was again according to the convention. Listing means that the convention asks you to, I mean, you as a high contracting party of the convention, you are able to say that I want to nominate or inscribe a few sites on a special protection regime of the convention, of the Hague Convention. Iraq, interestingly, said that because we have over 10,000 sites in Mesopotamia and elsewhere, and also because our historic cities are full of historic buildings, we cannot just nominate few sites. So they didn't put any sites on the special protection list of the convention, and same for the Iran. Iran didn't put any sites on the Hague Convention list, and I should say that's a separate list from the UNESCO World Heritage List, completely two different protection regimes. A Commissioner General, again under, I think it is Article 16, excuse me if I don't remember the number of the article, but the Article 16, or one of the articles of the convention, they say that for the implementation of the convention, there can be a general commissioner for the convention, but that person or that commissioner was not appointed. Although a person was introduced or nominated, but because the countries should accept that person as a general commissioner, and because there was no agreement of the person who was introduced, so there was no general commissioner for the implementation of the Hague Convention during the conflict. In terms of intentional destruction, that was something that I tried to highlight in my presentation, because there were not many cases, or maybe not any case of intentional destruction, so that was not raised. Exceptions were two. One in Isfahan, which Iran said that the mosque was deliberately targeted, and the mosque in Basra, which Iraq said the same. So this was why two missions were sent to Iran and to Iraq. but we didn't find any follow-up reports on these two cases, although that was the case that was raised by both countries. I hope that was enough on this. Another, the academy, the role of academia, replying to Omar. Yes, we didn't have active NGOs or civil societies during the war, although in Iran, heritage NGOs and civil societies, they came to the scene about 10 years after the conflict, and now you can see many NGOs or civil societies, but during the conflict, that movement didn't exist, and I guess, I know that the same was in Iraq during the conflict. But unfortunately, during and after the conflict, and even now, you cannot see any academic research on the impacts of the war on cultural heritage, on archaeology, on intangible heritage. You need to read papers and articles to find a sentence that talks about the war. You need to read many archaeological reports, mission reports to find, aha, that person couldn't excavate here because the field was still polluted by landmines. Aha, that person says, okay, during my visit to that city, I saw that mosque or that building that was destroyed. No, there was, interestingly and unfortunately, there was, and still there isn't a focused research on the impact of that war, not just on tangible heritage, but for example, we had massive migrations, forced migration from both countries, from the border areas, and nobody has done a research on, for example, how it impacted languages, dialects, local languages, and traditions, and things in terms of intangible heritage. Final point, yes, youth, about your question about what about other types of heritage, if, for example, Iran and Iraq have collaborated on protection or reconstruction on other types of heritage. There was one example that was raised, at least, by the Iranian Ministry of Cultural Heritage, Tourism and Handicrafts, and that was about 2 years ago. And that was about Ctesiphon, the Arch of Ctesiphon, when the arch was at risk of collapsing. So they said, okay, we are happy to support Iraqi colleagues, but again, that didn't take place, didn't happen, and that was finally sponsored by ALIF, International Alliance for Heritage Protection in conflict areas. There are many reasons why Iranian cultural heritage ministry is not active in other types of heritage, which we can discuss later, but for economic reasons, for capacity reasons, or yeah, for many other reasons. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Finally, Dr. Khani.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, just I try to be very quick. The first question, which Dr. Rouhani actually mentioned part of the answer. In my view, the potential is there. I mean, when they see how successful have been the efforts of reconstruction in the holy shrines or religious sites, why not the other places? I mean, that could be implemented in other areas, other places. And this, again, confirms the fact that there exists what I call it common cultural heritages sharing between Iran and Iraq. The Ctesiphon is a very good example. Iranians were very happy to participate in the reconstruction of the Taq Kasra, or Ivan Madain, as they call it in Persian, which is a very interesting, very important part, remaining part of the ancient Ctesiphon city from the Sassanid Empire. So in that sense, that could be a good example. And also, as I said, this effort can spill over into other sites or other areas. As for the distinguishing between cultural diplomacy or trying to influence the Iraqi society by doing or somehow contributing to the reconstruction projects. Well, it's a very delicate line, a fine line to separate between the two, because both are true. I mean, it's very difficult to distinguish the willingness to contribute to the reconstruction projects and also to separate it from the natural influence that it brings by itself. But as I said, this is a challenge for the Iran and Iranian initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much دكتور خاني. هكذا تنتهي الجلسة.
We are done. Now we have lunch for 1 hour, and then we'll come back at 2 p.m. to resume our conference. Thank you very much.